Hi, everyone. Hopefully, you're having a great semester so far. Just wanted to touch base and check in with you about chapters 1 through 3. Some of you guys have probably already started in on that reading. Those of you who are just getting your books today or at the end of last week, go ahead and dive into reading chapters 1 through 3. But these chapters are great because they introduce you to a lot of the key terminology that you're going to be using to discuss art in this class. One of the great things about this class, as opposed to maybe an art history survey, is that not only are we going to be looking at a lot of art, but there's going to be more emphasis on learning the language to discuss art as opposed to like memorizing dates of slides and things like that. So through this class, you're going to be developing what we call visual literacy, which is actually one of the key terms in chapters 1 through 3 of your text. So I don't know how many of you guys have been to a museum or a gallery before. I hope most of you, but if you haven't yet, then hopefully you will have attended one by the end of this class. But when you go to a museum or a gallery, you're typically overwhelmed with lots of artwork. So it's kind of hard to know where to look. But one thing you've probably not thought about before is the amount of time that the average person spends looking at a work of art. So the average gallery or museum goer spends between 2 and 4 seconds looking at each work of art, maybe 1 second at a lot of them. But when you're in a giant room that's sort of, an open floor plan the size of Macy's, covered with art, it's really hard to not feel like you need to look at each piece and just sort of like like go around the room and like look at each one, pretty quickly. 2 to 4 seconds doesn't sound like very much time, but I challenge you the next time you're in a space that does have art, even if it's just like your dentist's office and they have some art in the lobby, time yourself, see how much time you normally spend looking at a work of art. There's actually a really great movement that started in 2010. It's called Slow Art Day, and it takes place every April in museums and galleries across the world. And Slow Art Day challenges museum goers to spend 10 minutes looking at just 5 works of art. So 10 minutes each for those 5 works of art. And then those who have attended the event all gather together for lunch afterwards and they discuss the things that they've sort of mined from those pieces while they have, developed a greater relationship with that piece over those 10 minutes. So just something for you guys to think about. Your first chapter does talk a lot about active seeing, and active seeing is going to be that intentional, slow art kind of looking at a piece. Doesn't necessarily have to be 10 minutes, but when you're actively looking at a work of art, when you're participating in active seeing or intentional seeing, you are looking beyond like, that's a picture of an apple. And, really looking at the artist's medium, like, is it an oil painting? Is there physical texture that's built up on that canvas? So I challenge you guys to be active seers as you are looking at a work of art, especially in the context of this class and giving that piece your full attention. I know that you may not be familiar with all the types of art that have been introduced in these chapters. There's actually some very large public works, an Olympic Stadium with a fireworks display that's introduced in those chapters. There's some performative based artworks that are introduced there. As we move into later chapters in the book, those chapters will focus on individual mediums. But you'll see that under the pictures that the text includes of those works, it talks about what those things are made of and how they are made. But we'll dive more into that later. Um, Another thing that you're going to hear, a buzzword you'll probably hear a lot, and you've probably heard it before, but maybe you don't necessarily know what it means, is aesthetics. So when we're talking about aesthetics, we're talking about what a work of art looks like. So it's not necessarily, well, it's definitely not what a work means when we're talking about aesthetics. It's all about the visual. So your text defines the term aesthetics as a cultural understanding of what that society deems beautiful. So aesthetics are going to be different, probably from culture to culture. You probably, have heard a lot people talk about the different ways that the human body is portrayed throughout culture. And you look at Botticelli's, and the body is sort of celebrated as being this soft, beautiful vessel for life. And then you might look at Cubist works from early last century, and the body is depicted as very angular. So just different ways of celebrating the same thing, but aesthetics are going to be those different cultural notions of what things look like and what we want them to look like. But if we say something is aesthetically pleasing, that's probably a term that you've heard a lot. Maybe you're visiting houses looking at Christmas light displays, and you might say that's aesthetically pleasing, a house with beautiful light display. And then you might see another one that's got a bunch of inflatables in front of it, which we all love a holiday inflatable, but maybe your grandma doesn't love a holiday inflatable because that's not how she was raised. That's not what she thinks is a lovely holiday decoration. And she might be like, that's tacky. And that's because that is not what she finds aesthetically pleasing. So that's a good example, I think. So aesthetics are what things look like. And then they also usually bring in our opinion about whether we like the way they look or not. Another thing that you'll probably be diving into this semester, you'll definitely be diving into, is thinking about what the artist's intentions are when they're making a work of art versus how you interpret a work of art. So sometimes when you're in a museum or a gallery or just looking at work online, you are provided with an artist's statement. An artist's statement is going to be exactly what it says, probably a paragraph long, maybe a page long, text from the artist regarding their practice, regarding what has inspired the work, and regarding what they're wanting to share with you by making the work. However, those statements are not always going to be present when viewing a work of art. For example, in the case of public art, maybe you've walked around Central Park in New York City or other public outdoor spaces. There's lots of art near Falls Park in Greenville, lots of public sculptures. You're not able to read artist statements when you're viewing those artworks in the environment they've been placed in. So your analysis of the artwork is not wrong if it's different than what the artist's intentions were. That's the beauty of art, is that there's so many different stories. That the story that were given by the artist, there's the story that you're able to form by viewing it based on your own personal experiences. So later on, for our first writing assignment, we will actually be writing about a work of art. I don't want you to rely on the information that the artist gives you. It is important in a historical context, and sometimes reading those statements will open your mind and give you that sort of, oh, I see what they're doing there moment with the work of art. But they're not the end all be all. And that's the beauty of, putting art for the public to consume, is that we can form our own opinions of that work. So I want to chat a little bit about some of the stuff I've already said, and also some of the other terminology in these first chapters. And to do so, I've actually pulled a couple of pieces of art off the walls in my home to talk to you about their different compositional elements and the different ways that we might look at some works. So here is a photo. Oh, not too bad of a glare there. So we've got a photo of, it's actually from a laundromat. Oh no, it's a scanning facility in New York City. A friend of mine took this. She is a Spartanburg-based photographer. Ignore the reflections that are happening here. But one thing that I think is great about this photo is it has a very simple composition. When we talk about the composition of an artwork, we're talking about the way that things are laid out on the surface of the work. So if it's a 2D work, which is going to be a flat work, like a photo or a painting or a drawing or even a print, we're usually talking about the way things are laid out on the page or on the canvas or the panel. If it is a 3D work like a sculpture, we're going to be talking about the way things are laid out in physical space. So, compositionally, this work is pretty simple. Um, both main elements of it are central. They're centered with negative space around them, and it is very symmetrical. So the only thing that's really not symmetrical is the hand because the thumb comes out, at a different angle than the other fingers. But for all extensive purposes, this composition is symmetrical. And what that means is that if you fold it in half, it's going to be equal on both sides. So this composition is symmetrically balanced, if that makes sense to you. Got symmetry going on there. Another thing I do want to talk to you about is positive space and negative space. So I did sort of drop in those words kind of slyly just there. And negative space is going to be space that's sort of breathing room in the composition. Sometimes it's space that's not taken up by a physical thing. Sometimes it's space that, it might have physicality to it, but really we're not getting a lot of information there. So here, the negative space is going to be this blue. And I assume that that is a physical door or a wall that this window is inset in. But for the sake of this photo, it exists as negative space. There's nothing happening there. That negative space frames the other parts of the composition. This circle, this sign up here. So, and then the positive space is going to be the window with the hand, and also the sign, because there's nameable elements that we can chat about there. So let me select another one. So here's another photo from the same series. This photo was actually taken at, okay, that's better. This photo was taken at the South Carolina State Fair. So that's kind of fun. And it is a double exposure. So this is not reflection you're seeing here. This is the woman who is churning the cotton candy. It's actually been like double exposed with the sky being visible sort of through her skin. So we actually have some transparency that's happening there. A lot of these words that we use to talk about art are just words that you would normally use to talk about things in your life as well. So transparency means exactly what you think it means. You can see something through something else. It's not a full transparency like a window, but we do have lots of layers happening here. This piece, when we're going to talk about the way that it's balanced and sort of the way visual weight is distributed. So it's not physical weight, it's going to be the weight of the things that you're seeing. This piece has more of an L-shaped composition. So it's sort of an L this way and then also an L this way. We could call it a U-shaped, really. But it's asymmetrically balanced because we have a large form happening here and then sort of a smaller form happening here. And that's not central. And the fact that it's not centrally split actually makes it more dynamic because a piece like the one that we just looked at, because it's symmetrically balanced, the eye just goes bloop. That's where it goes. There's not really anywhere else for your vision to travel for this piece. So you're just like, that's the thing. This piece, because of its asymmetry, there's a lot of different places that our eyes can go. So if we're going to the woman first, then we're sort of going to the cotton candy, going to the big cotton candy vat, then going up here. And then this line right here, which is a line that's just created by a structure, takes us back over to this side. So line has a lot of different functions, and we can talk about that more as well. You may see line just because someone in a painting or a photo is wearing a striped t-shirt, or a cop car has a stripe on it or something like that. But line is created by physical structures as well. So we have a line that's created here by this um, cotton candy machine. We have lines that go up here. And then this line, it's really helpful. It brings the vision back to here. The woman's arm creates a line. So lots of ways that line is used in a way that you might not expect because it's not a physical line that's drawn. It's lines that are created by things that are in the composition, like the arm, like the machine, and then like this building here. I would also say we haven't really started talking about color yet in these chapters, but color is something that we will talk about a lot when we're talking about art. This work has a pretty limited color palette. So that means it's not colorless and it's not monochromatic. You guys have probably seen monochromatic works before. Be like if it was a portrait of me with a big blue filter put over it and everything is just different colors of blue. So this is not monochromatic, but we do really have pretty limited color. We have these pastel, yellow, blue, and pink. The cotton candy mimics the sunset in the background. So we do have some orange that's brought in there as well. But it's mostly pastels and then these sort of like shadowy dark colors of sort of black and brown. So very limited. We're not seeing anything that's really in the middle there. It's all very light pastels or sort of shadows. So really interesting composition to talk about there. Another thing that we should talk about is when things are realistic versus abstract. So that's something that you guys will be using in conversation a lot. And something to understand is that realism is not the same as representation. So by representing something, sorry, I just picked up this painting and I'm not ready to talk about it yet. But let's say this garden tomato here. This is a real tomato, but if I wanted to take a picture of it, it's photorealistic because it's a photo. So we wouldn't really call it photorealistic. But if I then wanted to make a painting from that photo that was so realistic that it looks like the photo, we would call that photorealistic. Likewise, if I wanted to make a painting from the photo that looks realistic but not quite photorealistic, we would call it realistic. And then I wanted to make a painting of it that like you're still going to be able to name that it's a tomato, but you don't believe that it's something that you can just pick up right off the canvas. We would call that representation. So this painting I'm going to show you, we would call this representational. So this was also made by a local artist. Her name's Claire Luca, and she's actually an art teacher in the area. And she makes a lot of these works that depict figures that are representational in the sense that you can name what's being depicted, but they're not realistic. So you would not look at this and be like, wow, that's a photo of Mary and Joe. It looks just like them. It's more like two, anonymous figures that are dancing. There's also, sort of unrealistic curve happening to the body. They also don't exist in a space that we could name as real. So you can kind of see the background is just made up of shapes that might make us, feel like they represent music and movement and the blur of a wonderful evening with your favorite person. There are piano keys, but we don't necessarily see a full representation of a piano, and the angle that it's at, doesn't make any sense. So hopefully this makes sense the way I'm explaining it to you. But this painting of these two figures dancing, we would call it representational because we can name what it is, but we wouldn't call it realistic. They don't look like real figures. And something that I do hear a lot when my students are discussing work, and it's an easy mistake, is to think that realism and representation are the same. And you're like, oh wow, it really looks just like them, but actually it's abstracted kind of a little bit. Um, it is sort of hard to understand because representation and abstraction can exist simultaneously. Because when something is pulled away from looking realistic, the act of pulling it away from that realism is it's abstraction because you're abstracting the reality. So this work is actually both representational and abstract because we can name, what we're seeing, but it's not really existing in the real world. Another thing I want to talk to you guys about is subject matter and content. So it's really easy to get those things confused because, the contents of a cereal box are usually exactly what you think they're going to be. It's cereal. But the content of a work of art is different than the subject matter. So the subject is what you're seeing. So the subject here is two figures dancing. And you could say the piano is part of the subject below. But the subject is two figures dancing. And then here, the subject is a woman making cotton candy at the fair. But if we're talking about the content is more related to the artist's meaning and the general sort of mood or story that you're getting from a piece. So the content here could be love, it could be music, the content could be, like I said, it's a wonderful evening. It could be, the the blur of time when you are dancing the night away and swept up in music and love and all those things. But the subject matter is the two figures dancing, if that makes sense. Um, the content of this photo, the subject is a woman making cotton candy, but the content could be, the relaxation that is imminent at the end of a long day of work because the sun is setting and maybe she's smiling a little bit, she's really looking forward to the fact that she gets to go home soon and put her feet up. The content could also be nostalgia. The fair is something that a lot of us associate with childhood and being able to sort of relax and unwind and act like kids. So there's content is something that you can pull out when you are actively seeing and analyzing and thinking about what's happening there. There's one more piece that I'm going to show you. This is a print actually by Frida Sue, who teaches in the printmaking department at USC Upstate. She made these last year around Christmas time. But I would say the subject matter is a snow globe, but the content is, the beauty of winter, and the sort of wonder that we experience when holding a snow globe and thinking about that time of year and those kinds of things. This piece, just sort of going back to review some of the terms I've talked about, is symmetrically balanced. So it's centered on the paper. The trees are not, exactly the same height. So you do have some asymmetrical balance happening there with the trees and the moon only being on one side and the shadow happening over here. So that does create some nice asymmetry there. But the snow globe itself is symmetrically balanced. So these are ways that we can talk about these different works of art. Another thing that I just want to touch on really quickly, we talked a little bit about line when we were looking at the photo of the fair, but there is one kind of line that is a little bit confusing, and that's implied line. Implied lines are lines that you can't necessarily name outright. So it's not lines like that are happening on the piano, like each key is a line. An implied line might be, like the curve that this whole composition is creating of these bodies dancing. Um, an implied line could also be invisible. So, sort of going back to this photo, there is line that's happening like where these different bags of cotton candy are hung. Um, and connecting different things to each other in the space. So implied lines are another thing that you need to really actively look and see, to be able to name. So this all takes practice, looking at art and being able to name what it is you're seeing. It also takes bravery to sort of say what you think you're seeing, and be worried that it's wrong. And I don't want you guys to be worried that what you're going to say is wrong. I want you to just say what you think, and then we'll sort of unpack that together. So this week's discussion forum, we'll be practicing with that a little bit. I hope this was helpful for you guys. Please let me know if you have any questions. And I look forward to chatting more with you in this week's discussion. Thanks.